Welcome to Curiosity, a podcast discussing Christianity for the merely curious. I'm Trevor Cook, and I'm joined today by Andrew Bass, my good friend and co-founder of Curiosity. Andrew is a youth minister in the Anglican Church of North America, and as of very recently, he's no longer a master's candidate at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. He is a graduate, an alumni. Congratulations on receiving your master's degree, my friend.
Thank you,
Uh,
Trevor. A lot of long hours. It's a good feeling.
Well, it is certainly good to be back with you here in a brand new year, continuing our series in session. We're making our way through the Ecumenical Councils, and we have reached the fifth Ecumenical Council, known as the Second Council of Constantinople. And I'm going to just leave it at that, but also say thank you, Andrew, for all that you did to fill in during my absence. Some great episodes were produced, and you were an excellent host for our guests. I enjoyed listening to them myself, so I hope everyone else did too.
Thank you, Trevor. I must say it's nice to have. I can sit back now and not take the host reins. That was fun while it lasted. But I'm glad that you are back.
Cool. Good to be back. So for this council, I'm excited because I think there's a lot more drama going on. We have kind of more of a at odds competition between the head of state, the emperor, and the head of the church, the pope. So this is going to be kind of a more drama-filled episode, I think, and one that truly highlights kind of one of the darker parts of history for the Roman Catholic Church. So we're gonna get to hit on a few juicy subjects, but also talk metaphysics, which is my favorite. So I'm looking forward to breaking into this thing. Where should we begin?
I guess we can start where we left off. So we know the controversy that led to Chalcedon, right? This was in the 5th century, so the 400s. We've already had the Nicene Creed. We've already established the Trinity. We've already established the deity of Christ. So the church is, slowly developing a more and more, I wouldn't say complex, but detailed Christology. And that's what brought us into these first 3 councils. And then the 4th council comes when we have this idea, right? Jesus is God. The Trinity is there. And now people start asking, okay, well, how then? This is almost like pre-scholasticism. Like, how is Jesus man and God? And when you start asking questions like that, you start getting some dangerous answers. And so we have guys like Nestorius, right, that is big on 2 natures, but not in the way that Chalcedon would have explained it. And so there were these explanations, some people saying like Theotokos, if you remember Mary as the God bearer, some people would reject that and say, no, Mary did not give birth to the Word. She only gave birth to the Son, the man part of Jesus, right? And that was a problem because now it's almost like, wait, I don't think that's how these 2 natures play out. And then on the other side, you had Cyril, right, who supported these 2 natures kind of pre-incarnation that blended, and he would affirm that Jesus is fully man and fully God, but in this one nature way that was a result of him, the incarnation in Christ becoming man. And we had our good friend, we called him Eutyches. I don't know if it's Eutyches or Eutyches or what, and all of those fun names that came and argued at the council. And ultimately we got the doctrine that we have, right? That Christ is 2 natures, fully man and fully God, but they aren't like these separate equations that are like linked one with each other. But they also don't stop being 2 natures just because Christ was born as a man. So that's what happens, right? Recap of our last episode. And then time goes on. That ends in 453. And if we remember, this was not something that was received very well by the church. The council happened after a failed first attempt, right, for Nicaea 2, that
Yeah,
didn't end up working.
We get
Yeah,
the sham council, we get the
yeah.
competition afterwards, the unread letters and ignored
Mhm.
notices, and everyone
Yeah.
gets kicked out and then brought back in again. So it's a
Yep.
interesting combination of kind of a fight for power between the separate seats in the church, but also we have the Emperor of the Roman Empire involved again with
Mhm.
how this is being handled and how these issues are being smoothed over. So
Mhm.
now I'm sure we're getting further and further to the split between East and West, because
Mhm.
it's difficult when you have such a large bit of territory there that people are teaching and learning, and they're doing so at very far distances away from one another, not easily traveled between, and not easily communicated between either of these dioceses as well. Letters, no doubt, take a long time to reach their destination. So
Mhm.
I'm interested to see how this continues to, cause issues of miscommunication, especially as we deal with things that are difficult enough to explain in person. To try to talk about them across hundreds and hundreds of miles
Yeah.
without any internet. I'm sure it's going to be a really good conduit for this conflict.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what happens. So the non-Chalcedonian churches, remember we talked about the people that rejected this council, which was a lot. It took Rome and the East both took a long time before they would recognize Chalcedon. Um, they just kind of continued. The Assyrian church with Nestorius and venerating him, and the Cyrillian Christians who were supporting Cyril's position. Um, they just kind of continued believing what they were believing, and things just continued to create this rift between Christians. And so for 100 years, basically, um, there were these churches kind of splitting from each other. They started what was called the Acacian, I guess would be the word for it, the Acacian Schism. So churches in the East were separated. The East and the West is further separated for about 35 years. I think this lasted, where there was an actual schism in the church over the teaching of Christ's natures and how he's fully man and fully God. And so this is where we get the Armenian uh, or church. We get the Assyrian Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox churches, and more. At this point, were in schism, so there was no longer this one united church under the Roman Emperor. And of course, as you can imagine, the Roman Emperor didn't like that. And at this point in history, it's still the emperor who's calling a lot of the shots. It's the emperor who convokes councils and calls them. And so a string of emperors tried, right? Justinian is our emperor when we finally get to the council in 553. But there are a few emperors before him. Anastasius, I believe, was the first one that kind of started trying to figure this out in maybe like the 480s and 490s AD, and calling bishops together, or just kind of trying to get some um, connection to Chalcedon and unity so the church could heal the schism and come back together. And so maybe I'll give you a chance to stop me if we want to talk about this later. But what that ended up doing was creating something called Neo-Chalcedonianism. And now that was the solution to the problem. There were these guys who were not getting rid of Cyril. They were like, this is a good view. And so just like we saw in Chalcedon, there was an explanation for it. Okay, well then we have to figure out how we can make this position um, line up with the words of Chalcedon.
Right. So let's take a step back though, because this is a long timeline to kind of have all of this
Hmm.
stuff going on in. Because I know that we're summarizing it all based on the ecumenical councils. So we're jumping through a lot of other things that are happening historically at the time. But this is an ongoing issue for a full century,
Hmm.
which imagining a century of like a history within this nation going by with all the other issues that could occur during that time, and then to have this consistent debate over whether or not Chalcedon is correct, or how to interpret the outcome of Chalcedon, and if it does
Hmm.
support Cyril's view or not. But that the result of this is that it doesn't even feel like an ecumenical council, was had, or that there was like
Hmm.
a solution to the previous problem. But we have these new camps and these new terms kind of like developed out of that, especially during what is a robust time for like philosophy and
Hmm.
the new theories on kind of being and stuff. And I know that we get some new names here. Do you want to just spend a moment to talk about monophysites and the miaphysites and kind of like uh, what those takes were on the outcome here, and just again to revisit what we've discussed in our last episode.
Hmm. Yeah, sure. So those were the two big terms, and monophysite and miaphysite, whatever. And that second term, miaphysite, is it's not anachronistic. It was around, but we use it a lot more charitably today. Back then, if you were at all, if anyone was suspicious at all that you were not in line with Chalcedon, you were called a monophysite, because that was a pejorative term. Nobody wanted to be called a monophysite. And so if you maybe believe, well, let me stop here and define them, Trevor. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So a monophysite, that mono there, like we talked about last time, is this belief that Christ has one nature, that Jesus just is one nature. And so that doesn't necessarily mean he's not fully, that he's not man and God. It could be this combination, but there was no like previously two natures and now one. It's just Jesus has one nature. And whatever it is that Jesus is, God and man, it's one. And the Miaphysites did not believe that. They had more of that Cyrillian position that, like, no, Jesus is fully man and fully God. But after the incarnation, those two natures blend into one. So it's an important distinction. But yeah, anyone that's accusing no one would accuse you of being a Miaphysite. Monophysite definitely hurt more. That kind of dug to the bone. So that's the name that people were throwing around. It'd be like our modern day, like anyone you disagree with, calling them Hitler.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that Nestorius? Isn't that the Hitler?
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
No, so I think that sums it up pretty clearly. It's definitely a difficult subject to be like, oh, here's the infinite nature, and here's human nature, and we're gonna pack them into one and make sense of how that agrees. And
Mhm.
that's the hot topic issue, which we know doesn't really affect much about church practice.
Yeah.
um, which is an interesting thing. It's like if everyone, if over predestination we're just fighting over that for 100 years, and every
Hmm.
president who ever was trying to smooth it over. So I'm interested now, what instigates them finally sealing the deal and having a council.
So, I would say the big thing that happens is there was this attempt at getting rid of all of the Monophysites. So it was Pope. I'm going to get this name so wrong, but Agapetus. Let's say that Agapetus,
Hmm.
um, Pope before Vigilius, who was there for this council. They had this plan. They wanted to get rid of all of the Monophysites, and so they worked with the emperor and said, "Let's banish all of them from Constantinople." Because remember, Constantinople is the new Rome, and they said this is becoming a problem. This is bad. There were faction churches, like we talked about, that would become the Oriental Orthodox and all of this, who were like specifically consecrating and ordaining dozens and dozens, I mean hundreds of Monophysite bishops or Nestorian bishops or this or that. And so there was this widespread attempt throughout the empire to get rid of all of them. And the idea, not necessarily kill them, but exile them, depose them. The idea was, and maybe we don't learn our lesson through history. If we get rid of all of the Monophysite bishops, then the problem will go away. And
Containment policy. We could
yeah.
surely uproot the heresy by just
Hmm.
eliminating the ones who are spreading it.
Yep. And so that was basically what happened. Constantinople cleared house. They didn't allow any Monophysites or people they suspected of being a Monophysite to be ordained. And all of this now is happening 540s, so
Hmm.
like around 540 plus AD. So we're still about 10, 13 years before the council will actually take place. But this is the groundwork that's happening. They're thinking that they can silence this problem and move on from it, and that clearly doesn't work, or we wouldn't be having this episode talking about the council.
Truly. Yep. So
Hmm.
now we're having the fifth council. As mentioned previously on our other episodes, ecumenical councils are generally at this point they're all called by the emperor at that time. And you said we had Justinian is who we're
Yes,
dealing with this one?
yeah, Justinian. So the Eastern Roman Emperor, the big Kahuna.
Right. And so the big
Yeah.
kahuna is going to blow the whistle and the game's going to come to a halt and everyone's going to come together for pep talk and meet again on the field. So what's going on for Justinian in doing this and what's the reaction? Because previously we know the emperors have tried and failed to
Hmm.
recall Chalcedon and have a formal discussion about resolving this.
Yeah. Oh, well, and this is where we're going to start to see, as you mentioned earlier, the Great Schism had been building for centuries before 1054, when the formal Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches split. Um, and in reality, a lot of that is because they weren't as neat and tidy in the early centuries of the church as they were in the turn of the millennium. So we have this issue that we've encountered a few times now, where the Bishop of Rome, the Roman part of the church, uh, has this idea that the Bishop of Rome is the successor of Peter, and that it's really kind of him who gets the final say. He's the manager with the checklist and the clipboard, and he kind of oversees all of this. And they would even say, like, that's why the Pope doesn't go to councils, because he just ratifies them, and stuff like that. And so we saw that with Celestine sending that legate Philip in the Third Council. We saw the response to the anathemas in the Fourth Council, where the bishops of the council weren't really interested in just checklisting a list of anathemas sent by the Bishop of Rome. They felt that there needed to be a council, and they even made that canon, right, in Chalcedon, that Leo never signed,
Yeah.
basically saying that a bishop only has authority over his jurisdiction. Which I know Roman Catholics listening, I understand there are different ways to interpret that, so please don't attack us. But um,
The
there's
quote
clearly,
unquote tome of
yeah,
Leo, right? It was
yeah,
ignored,
hmm
left in the corner while everyone
hmm
else talked and made their
yeah,
decisions. So,
yeah, and of course we know, because the Great Schism happened, we know that this friction was real. Like there
mhm,
was half of the church that didn't believe that the Pope had this power that he had kind of been claiming to have since the Third Council.
right.
Um, we actually have a letter. I promise I'm getting us to where we need to be. But there was Pope Gelasius, who was in the late 400s, um, leading up to this council. We've got written, this is Leo Donald in his book on the councils. Before and during his pontificate, Gelasius wrote theological works developing his arguments against Acacius. So remember the Acacian Schism that was happening right now. The Pope pointed out that the Roman See, above all, was bound to carry out the decrees of the councils, since, and this is his quote, since it ratifies each council by its authority and safeguards it by ceaseless oversight, in virtue of its leadership, which the blessed Peter the Apostle received by word from the Lord, and which by common agreement of the church he has always possessed and still retains. So, by the sixth century, so by the turn of the end of the 400s, the fifth century, the Roman Church
Mhm.
had really kind of developed this idea that we see tracing back to Philip, that legate sent in the Third Council. Um, and so that's kind of how Vigilius, the Pope for the Fifth Council, felt. And Justinian was a very hardline, devout guy. He cared about the church, and of course, he cared
Mhm.
about uniting the empire. And he was calling the shots. He wanted the council to be in the east, right? To be in Constantinople. The Pope didn't want that. He wanted it to be in the west. He wanted a bunch of Western bishops and equal representation. And so that also helped us kick the can. That's why it took so long for this council to happen, because the Pope and the Emperor were butting heads
Mhm.
over this idea of authority. They clearly had two different ideas of who was in charge of the church.
Truly. And again, like the way this might sound is that it's like just these two guys duking it out, but they have supporters and factions, and there are
Hmm.
people who believe that in both sides of this at that point, who are just Christians within the church
Hmm.
who support these views. And so it's important to note too that like that, like growing issue between the two is not exclusively, this isn't their cage match for like some
Yeah.
grudge. It's a serious authority issue, because we have seen in the past this power of the emperor and this power growing in Rome.
Hmm.
And it's important continue to follow that apostolic succession, which we've talked
Hmm.
about, and that gives him some level of authority. But we also see that a lot of these dioceses that have the highest level of authority also have a economic and political importance as well within the empire. And so there's a balance there that's been kind of uh, we shouldn't say maintained, because it's clearly not been maintained and there's been a
Hmm.
lot of issues. But that's why we've been, building up that schism for so long, because there has been this, growing divide, east and west, different dioceses of power, and between the Roman Empire and the church itself. So now that we're actually arriving at the council, let's get into the details. Let's start with just who was there, and then we can get into what happened. So, how many bishops did we get this time?
Yeah. So there were approximately 150. I guess Google says 152, so we can go with that. Leo Donald gives us some leeway, but somewhere around 150. So they gathered in 553 in what is today Istanbul, Turkey, but back then Constantinople, which is why this was the Second Council of Constantinople, or to confuse it, the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Um, and there
And the
were,
sixth episode that we've had on the ecumenical councils, because
yeah,
truly, yeah,
yeah.
we anyway just confuse the numbers even more. Two natures, one nature,
Hmm.
and
And
now you could go.
oh, that's fine. And so they had mainly Eastern bishops. Okay, so Pope Vigilius is not getting his way. And
Oh.
so it's a council being held in the East. I think there's a 14, 16 Western bishops. The rest are Eastern, which again it is unfair in a sense, but it's not as unfair as it sounds. Remember, the East is the center of Rome at this point, and so it would make sense that um, the influential bishops, or just the majority of them, are over
Yeah.
there. And so they gathered. Pope reluctantly kind of agrees. 553 to discuss three big things. So all of it pertains to the nature of Christ, like who he is, and defining him and defending Chalcedon, right? So it's just like we've
Hmm.
learned, they're going to tie all of those previous councils in and say like this is in line with the last four. So the first thing they wanted to address the Monophysites, and so that's what we're going to see a bunch of their canons. That's the first thing they address is they're reaffirming Chalcedon and providing more clarity and saying this is like if you believe this, this, and this, then you're anathema. So one,
Hmm.
nature of Christ, who's Christ. The second thing is the teachings of Origen. were getting really popular. And of course, this does pertain to the nature of Christ, but students of church history will know that Origen is a troublesome figure. Uh, he was a bit of a loose cannon and had a plethora of wild beliefs, and so definitely not a guy that you would want a theological school named after. And so there, but there are all these Origenist bishops teaching things throughout the Eastern Empire, the Eastern churches, and so they wanted to address that. And they gave equal time to anathematizing Origen and other people following his school. Um, and so that was the second thing, Origen and his followers and that little sect that had built up. And then the third was what has been called the three chapters. And these were writings by three different people. So it was it was and I'm going to get these names so wrong, but the person in writings of Theodore of Mopsuestia, uh, Theodoret of Cyrus's writings against Cyril, and then third was a letter of Ebus of Edessa to Maris the Persian. And the issue here is that all three of these documents, the three chapters, they accused of supporting Nestorius and Nestorianism, that Christ had a human and divine nature that was distinct, two different things instead of a united one. So basically, Nestorianism. So we've got defending Chalcedon, get anathematizing Origen and his followers, and then these three chapters just anathematizing Nestorianism.
Okay, so it's all a lot of this is repeats, and it's
Mm-hmm.
new material, new people, new names, but a lot of the same ideas that are still prevalent because in no case have we seen the full elimination of the heresy that we identify in the ecumenical councils. But I'm interested too with these three chapters. Like I know that these people are kind of important, but it it's kind of intriguing that the like way that they're now popping up as these like major supporters of Nestorius, who we've kind of focused on the other issues so far, but that Nestorius is still there. His impact remains, even if it's not exactly what he intended. The beliefs that they address with Nestorianism are still available. Like, and I know that we talked about like the issue of how important that was because the the complication of the natures being one and the same or two becoming one or two separate but together um, are all important, but the complication of separating the two entirely was the most extreme situation. So I'm interested to hear from you, Andrew, about like these these new chapters. Like, do they expand on the implications of it at all? Is there any like greater understanding of what the outcome is when Christology is taken that way, or is it just more the same, but addressing current people and current issues and discussions?
Um, there definitely are. They do elaborate on it. Actually, Pope Vigilius himself, at this point, I think he's in Rome. He's kind of on house arrest, and I don't remember if it was Rome or where it was, but he was kind of locked up in a church, and I think he was protesting as well. Um, and he initially did not want to anathematize the three chapters. He kind of had some asterisks next to it and was like, yeah, this, and this. But some of the issue was that at Chalcedon, some of these writings were affirmed. And so,
Okay.
yeah, and so Vigilius was like, you got, this is not the way to do it. Like, you can't backtrack. Like, we can defend the theology of Chalcedon without like walking back and looking at these documents that we once upon a time supported and now saying, actually, no. So, there was warrant there, and Vigilius tried that, but it did not bode well for him.
So wait, you're telling me that the Pope was kidnapped essentially by the Roman emperor? Was he being held there like for very long, or how long was this imprisonment within this particular church?
Yeah, he spent 7 months there. And you'll have to forgive me. I don't remember if he willingly I don't know if he willingly did that, or if he just wasn't allowed to go to Constantinople but was free to go somewhere else, or if it was just a protest of his own, kind of pouting and waiting for it to come over. But yeah, he spent 7 months there in that church and did not attend the council.
Oh man, I you cannot imagine that happening today.
Yeah.
So with this, new issues on the table, we're going to have some new anathemas, I'm guessing. And how many are we getting from this, and how clearly do you think they address the issues at hand?
Very clearly. So for one, 3 chapters, so we can call that 3 anathemas right there. Um, Council does that. Yeah, and then they have 14 anathemas. So remember, they were addressing two things: Christology and Nestorianism. 14 anathemas that explained their position, the Chalcedonian position, and then the beliefs of the heretics. Well, I shouldn't put it in quotes; they are heretics, but the beliefs of the. So 14 anathemas specifically about the Christology and the two natures, and then 15 more anathemas about the doctrines of origin and the school of followers that had come up in support of him. So overall, 32, right? 29, yeah. 32 anathemas.
Okay, that's a pretty productive council. I feel like in comparison to the rest, they did a lot.
Hmm.
And apparently they had a backlog, though it seemed.
Hmm.
So it makes sense. But now we have new condemnations. We
Hmm.
have a lot of people who I imagine are not going to be too happy about this, and a very strong-armed council by the East. That I'm sure there's going to be some difference in the West, and probably some people may not recognize this one afterwards. Well,
Hmm.
what's the backlash of the council that required imprisoning the Pope?
So, the Armenian Church, a very interesting church to look up. Maybe we should do an episode on them in the future because everyone forgets about them. They're still around, and they've been persecuted heavily. There was a genocide on them, I think, back in the 1980s, maybe before that, where like 2 million were murdered in Turkey. And the U.S. government won't recognize it for some reason. But anyway, that's an episode for a different
Yeah.
day. They in 491 they split, so they were no longer part of the church. They were rejected Chalcedon. Same thing with the Oriental churches. So those 6 churches, the Ethiopian church, the Coptic church, they never embraced this. And so they kind of now they would embrace Chalcedon, but they never embraced it. There were Monophysite churches. There were the Nestorian church, the Syrian church. So a lot of schism, a lot of fragmentation. Protestants weren't the first to do it.
Yeah.
It was very lot of splintering,
Yeah.
and the immediate aftermath. Very few churches accepted the Fifth Council, Constantinople too.
The
The
scope is getting much more narrow, it
hmm
seems. I
Yeah, and which you could expect, right? The more you add, the less people you're going to have on the train. Um, And Pope Vigilius himself did not affirm all of these anathemas and all of these canons, right? He rejected the 3 chapters thing and among others. And it took about 6 months before he was basically forced by the Emperor Justinian um,
Mhm.
to relent and
Mm.
accept it. And he claims that he always would have accepted it, but he was like someone misled him, and he misunderstood the teachings. This was also after Justinian launched a basically what would you call like an expose or a hit on the Pope. So there was this whole like list of why he's such bad character and how dishonest he is, and then of course after that he relents and
Right.
affirms the anathemas of the council.
Okay. So eventually he gives up, and I think I heard with what I was looking at beforehand that he died like shortly afterwards. Like he doesn't return to Rome to be
Yeah,
the bishop of Rome for much longer uh after his relenting on this point.
yeah, he never makes it. He never makes it back to Rome. He dies shortly after affirming the anathemas, and that's that.
I could see how that could have gone a lot worse for the church at that point, but I know already that there's going to be future issues that
Hmm.
I'm sure this you know it's the echoes of this problem, echoes
Yeah,
of the curse, right?
yeah.
uh I'm interested to hear from you now with all that's happened. I believe that the Orthodox and Catholic, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Old Catholic, Anglican churches all affirm this ecumenical
Hmm.
council still. Um,
Hmm.
but I'm interested to hear from you what you think the lasting impact of what was brought out of this council is, because we are getting a lot of repeat theology.
Hmm.
We're reaffirming Chalcedon with most of what's coming out of this. But what do you think is actually the product of all of the the power struggle and the theology, and of course our you know the treatment of the Pope,
Hmm.
how that's going to affect the future?
Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. Other than the churches we listed, the Orientals, the Assyrian, the Armenian churches, all of Christendom, including Protestants. Now, I can't speak for all Protestants because there's not a Protestant church, but traditional Protestants that would read Calvin, Luther, Beza, the Anglican Church, and all that, affirmed this council. As we mentioned, it wasn't immediately affirmed. The Roman Church did not embraced this council as an ecumenical council. So they did until 680. At the sixth council, the third council of Constantinople, which will be our next episode. So it was 130 years after the council that the Roman Church. Remember, the Pope signed off on it, but the Roman Church, it took them 130 years in 680 to finally say this is an ecumenical council. This is the fifth. Um, and so I think what it gives.
Considering Chalcedon kind of went through the same thing, though, I mean, this
Yeah.
is starting to be the trend: is that one ecumenical council is not ecumenical until
Hmm.
the next ecumenical council says it is.
Yeah, and that'll continue to be the trend through seven. And that's why we're doing this series. After that, everyone splits and starts having their own councils. And so I think one thing that this gives us is just a blessing. We have this well of good Christology that spans over 500 years of faithful men and women working really hard to hash this out. And so I don't think it should be undermined. It's easy for us to like laugh at the little quibbles that they'd have between the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonians and all of that. But in reality, it defends important biblical truths. So I want to read this. This is not me. It's from Got Questions, which is a good resource if you're a Protestant at least. But this is true for everyone. In the end, erroneous teachings surrounding the person and nature of the Lord Jesus were condemned at the Second Council of Constantinople. It's quite possible that Justinian's motives were political as well as theological, but the assembly stood firm against heretical teachings. Some may consider the disagreements among the various factions in Constantinople as theological hair splitting, but the subject of Christology is hardly a peripheral issue. Every cult and ism, past and present, begins with a false understanding of the person and nature of God. Our finite minds cannot completely fathom the depths of Christ's character, but the plain teaching of Scripture is that he is fully God and fully man. Ultimately, the 14 anathemas issued by this council were justified and necessary.
Wow. Yeah. No, I think that sums it up really nicely. I mean, as much as I love the drama, I think it's fun
Hmm.
to discuss kind of the foibles of history, and those councils tend to bring out some of the worst in people, but they also are the example of how no matter what differences we have, there is such a enormous amount of care amongst like the bishops, amongst the Christians of this time, and all the way to this day about what our belief is about God and
Hmm.
what our relationship is to Christ, and His nature is at the center of all of that. That it is something of such importance that it will, despite these differences and the arguments and the issues and how it's carried out, um, that will bring us back together again over and over to have these councils to try to resolve these issues, to try to bring a quickly fading church family back into one picture frame.
Hmm.
So I do appreciate just that effort and the necessity to come together and to call those things out, to admonish bad teaching, and continue to hold consistent theology as kind of our priority as a culture and as an organization, and as a group, to make that our center, the pillar that we're built on is these ecumenical councils, these creeds and
Hmm.
anathemas that establish good practice, good faith, and I think that's a really encouraging factor. Even with the schisms that remain today, we'll always have these councils to come back to, and find common ground.
Hmm.
So I definitely appreciate it, and I appreciate your time spent researching this, Andrew, and talking about it. You gave some really great points tonight, uh, and I think we are good to close up for the night. If there's any
All
last
right.
words you wanted to share.
No, I think we'll leave it on that quote. Other people write better than I can speak, so thank you, Trevor.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be back. Happy New Year's, everyone.
Happy New Year.